My name is Kelly Keller, and I'd like to welcome you to my Interpersonal Communication Project, or ICP. I'm doing this presentation for Liberty University. Our class is HSCO 508. So sit back, relax, and I hope that you enjoy my presentation on how we communicate better. Next slide. So you might ask, what is interpersonal communication? Well, it's communication that happens when people talk, when we listen, and when we engage one another in order to maximize and enlarge our conversation. It's also positive communication. It encourages us to form contacts and to maintain our relationships, and it also enables us to make sense of the world we live in and how we experience things. Next slide. In our class, we also learned about our overarching goal. My overarching goal is to continue to explore our practical knowledge of communication by listening, observing, becoming more emotionally vulnerable to those in need. And also, I'd like to strive to listen better as I reflect the love of Christ. Next slide. So let's talk more about enlarging the conversation. What does it mean exactly? Enlarging the conversation means just basically learning how to communicate more effectively. It incorporates all the dynamics of communication, conversations, and dialogues that occur in our relationships. It also involves empathetic listening, nonverbal communication, and self-disclosure. So, in essence, healthy relationships are ones that nurture trust, respect, and mainly connections with others. Next slide. So, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am married with 3 children. I'm the youngest of 8. So we have a pretty large family. Most people will consider me the baby, but I just say I'm the youngest. I also consider myself a pretty good communicator. I have learned a lot in this class just about communicating, and I also consider myself very helpful. I like to help out in my community. Whenever I'm out and about and I see someone who's in need, I'm always more inclined to help them. So I like to give and I like to be involved, and I think of myself as kind and funny as well. Next slide. So let's talk more about behavioral blends. We learned this according to Carbonell's book, Understanding the People Puzzle. And in the book, he talks about the 4 temperament model of human behavior. And it's based on the model of DISC. And they all represent different entities of who we are. Some of us are active, outgoing. Some of us are reserved. Some of us are task-oriented. And some of us are passive. And so understanding the 4-quadrant model helps to explain why people basically do what they do. It describes how we feel, how we act, and how we think. Next slide. So, in this DISC model, we had to do a profile, and the profile described basically how we behave when we're interacting with people. My profile happened to be I, and it's uniquely relegated to myself, what I do, why I do, what I do. So, mine describes me as a person who loves to stand out in a crowd. People like to be around me. I'm a people person. Sometimes I can be prideful. Although the model is not completely accurate, it does give a generalization of how we behave. It also says that I love to talk, which is true. Talk to people, friendly and outgoing, and I'm an influencer. I think that's awesome. And I is also for charming and full of charisma. If you haven't seen that yet. Yes. Okay, next slide. So, the profile continues. It's not only I that's identified, but also a C. I'm an IC. And this is the behavior that's expected of me. ICs are inspiring and competent. They're also good public speakers, enthusiastic, knowledgeable. We can also be cautious and calculating. So we like to make decisions, but it takes us a minute to think about it, to solidify one. We can also be optimistic, free-spirited, and wise. Next slide. So, as I said, my behavioral model consisted of an IC personality. It's described as active and passive, as well as a people person and task-oriented. I describes me as being active and outgoing, and the C type describes me as being cautious, calculating, and careful. So ICs, like I said, are good presenters, good public speakers, and we're very optimistic. Next slide. So let's continue to talk more about the behavioral model that we learned from Carbonell. It also describes something that's called above the midline. And this is described as a person who is an overachiever type. All 4 letters of my personality type were above the midline. And it also indicates someone who's very motivated. So let me tell you some other features about being above the midline. They're seen as driven, and we tend to have more stress. We tend to take charge. So taking charge, that means that we take on a lot of responsibility, and it also means that we take on a lot of stress to go along with it. And we're also very passionate about everything. So not only do we have a cause, but we fight for the cause, and sometimes it leaves us very tired in the end. We're also visionaries, people planners, and sometimes we have too many irons in the fire, and I'm guilty of that. Next slide. So let's talk about how positive influences affect us. So I'm the type, I will influence others positively. I will support others in need, inspire people to do their best. I'm a good leader, but I can follow if necessary. I'm easygoing, and I'm also committed to see a project to fruition. In other words, I want to finish what I start. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the negative influences with this personality type. I don't handle conflict well. Sometimes I will take on other people's problems and add them to my own. And sometimes I can let my emotions get the best of me, and it might become a little overwhelming because of my helping, giving spirit. And I can sometimes be impatient and care too much. Next slide. So let's talk about our potential behavior communication barriers. Things that get in the way of how we talk, how we have conversations with each other, just in our day-to-day lives. So first we're going to talk about our internal barriers that inhibit us when we're in communication. Sometimes we can get tired, and sometimes we don't listen well. We're very poor listeners. Sometimes the subject matter may not really interest us, and so we kind of tune it out. Let's talk about some external things. We can have a lot of distracting elements. If you're in class and you're looking out the window, and there are things that just really distract us. They get in the way of communication. Next, let's talk about some solutions to communication barriers. Some of the solutions could be just being silent for a moment. Being silent so that we can enlarge our conversation and have effective listening. Also, I come up with getting 6 to 8 hours of sleep, interrupted sleep daily. That helps. If you don't get enough rest and you wake up and you're cranky and you're not ready to face the day. So getting lots of sleep improves our conversation. Also, intentional listening. reflecting the ideas that are presented, and absorbing them, really understanding what's being said. So also re-emphasizing ideas and facts given, and acknowledging nonverbal intentions. Next slide. So let's talk about internal and external communication, noise pollution, all those things that get in the way. So Burley Allen tells us listening is highly selective, it's subjective, and it's an experience. So some of the things are negative words, preconceived opinions, experiencing a power struggle, intellectual listening, dependent listening, and self-conscious listening. Those are the internal struggles that we have in communication barriers. Also, external things. Noise, like I said, fake listening, meeting deadlines get in the way, sometimes phone calls, traffic, temperature changes, among other things. Next slide. So, what are the solutions to the internal noise pollution? Just being aware of our perceptions of each other and being intentional and giving our attention to others when we're talking. Also being aware that there is an internal struggle. You know, our minds tend to wander sometimes, and we let that get in the way of communicating better. Also, receiving information through our five senses. Things that we smell, we taste, we touch, we feel, all affect us either positively or negatively when we communicate. Having a positive attitude, of course, helps in communication. Next slide. So, solutions to external noise pollution. Listening without being judgmental, being non-critical, maintaining eye contact, and being fully aware as we listen. All those things are important. So, what's our course of action to communicate better? So, cognitively, culturally, developmentally, perceptually, and socially, and psychologically, all hold implications for better communication. We have keep all those things in mind. It prepares us more. Also, if we compromise, if we give and take while we're communicating, finding some common ground as we're conversating, allowing others to take the lead. I know it may be hard sometimes, but we can do it. Also, focusing on listening better. Next slide. So our plan of action continue. What else do we need to do? Okay, so we need to agree to disagree. That could be very hard for us sometimes. We also need to watch out for hot topics. We want to create a positive environment and block out all those external and internal pollution noises that we sometimes let get in the way of communication. We want to improve our conversation and our concentration. And we also want to reflect the character of Christ and be a humble servant as he was. Next slide. So in conclusion, let's sum up what we've talked about. So learning to enlarge the conversation. It proves to be the single most important factor in the communication process. Christ was a weary servant, and he always ministered to people and to their needs. And so he bids us to do the same thing. We play a big part in just making the world a better place. And Paul says in Corinthians that we should depart in peace and love, and to abide in faith, hope, charity. But the greatest of these is charity. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed my interpersonal communication project.